Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Karen Gregory and George Lewis? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Karen Gregory was born in Albany, New York, sometime around 1948. She worked as an elementary school teacher and at one point lived in New Hampshire. Friends described Karen as friendly and free-spirited. In 1983, she moved to Pinellas County, Florida, and lived in an apartment with a roommate. She initially worked at a local restaurant as a bartender, but then found a job as a graphic artist. Karen met a man named David Mackey. He was an administrator in a counseling program. Karen and David became romantically involved. In 1984, Karen moved to David's house in Gulfport, Florida, which is about 5 miles west of St. Petersburg. On May 21, David made a business trip to Rhode Island. Therefore, Karen was alone in their new house. She was moving the last of her belongings from the apartment to the house. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On May 22, 1984, Karen spent the evening with a female friend of hers. She went to the friend's house at around 8 p.m., and they had dinner. Karen left the friend's house sometime between midnight and 1 a.m. Now on May 23, she returned to David's house in Gulfport. Later that same day, David, who was in Rhode Island, tried to reach Karen on the phone, but there was no answer. He contacted her former roommate and her sister, hoping that somebody had seen Karen. On the morning of May 24, David called Karen's employer and found out that she did not show up to work on May 23 or on that day, May 24. David called a neighbor named Amy Bressler and asked her to check if Karen's car was in the driveway. After Amy said that it was, David asked her to see if Karen was in the house. Amy walked over to David's house. She knocked on the side door, but there was no answer. She walked around to the front porch and noticed that the front porch door had been broken. There was glass everywhere. She went to the front door of the house, and again there was no answer. At this point, Amy walked around to a bedroom window. She saw the lower half of a woman's body covered in blood. She called the police at 8:39 a.m. They arrived and found Karen's body. Here's what the police uncovered during their investigation. Karen Gregory had been stabbed several times, and she was the victim of an assault of a sexual nature. The cause of death was her throat being cut. Karen was wearing lingerie. The glass was broken out of the front porch door, as I mentioned. No fingerprints with investigative value were identified. There was blood all over the house. A bloody handprint was found on Karen's leg. There were several bloody footprints made by bare feet around Karen's body. The most usable footprint, as far as identification, was one on a tile floor of the bathroom. It was a partial footprint. The police noticed that there was no blood on Karen's feet. Therefore, they believed that the footprints were left by the killer. The windowsill and the curtains for the bedroom window had blood on them. The police believed that the killer exited through that window. At about 1:15 a.m. on May 23, which would have been not long after Karen arrived home from the friend's house, over a dozen of Karen's neighbors heard a scream coming from her house. Nobody bothered to call the police. One neighbor said it was a short, high-pitched, agonizing scream. Another neighbor heard a door slamming after the scream. She believed that somebody was slapping a woman in a car. This neighbor did not think that the scream was consistent with somebody being in genuine danger. I guess it was more of a friendly, lighthearted scream, one that says, "I'm okay, don't bother calling the police or anything." One of Karen's neighbors was a man named George Lewis. He lived with his girlfriend, Grande. Their house was catty-corner to David's house. George was a St. Petersburg firefighter and the unofficial leader of the neighborhood watch. He had the sign in his yard. He told the police that he was working on his vehicle in his garage with the door open. He had the radio on. He heard a faint scream and walked out to the street to investigate, but he didn't see anything. His girlfriend, Glenda, also heard the scream. George also mentioned that on the evening of May 23, he saw a man drive by David's house and leave a note on Karen's vehicle, which was parked in the driveway. The police had found this note. They tracked it down to a man named Peter Cumble. The note said that he had stopped by, but found no signs of life. An interesting choice of words. The police interviewed Peter. He said that he had stopped by David's house at about 7:15 p.m. on May 23. He was supposed to have dinner with Karen. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Initially, the police thought that either Karen's boyfriend, David Mackey, or the man who left the note, Peter Cumble, could be involved in the murder. David had an alibi. He was in Rhode Island. Several people saw him there. He was excluded as a potential suspect. The police noticed that Peter had a scratch on his hand, and of course there was the word choice on the note, no signs of life. That didn't look too good. However, the police had nothing else against Peter. The police set him aside as a potential suspect, but because they had no other leads, the case was starting to grow cold. In December 1984, which was about 7 months after the murder, a conversation at a party changed the course of the investigation. A woman who lived 3 or 4 blocks from Karen's house was talking to a police officer at a farewell party for a coworker. She told the police officer that she heard a scream on the night of the murder. The police remembered that George Lewis said that he had heard a faint scream, yet George lived very close to David's house, which is where Karen was. This was confusing to the police. How would the scream have been faint from George's perspective, yet someone 3 or 4 blocks away could hear it? Now, of course, the scream was described in various ways by different neighbors, and George said that he had the radio on in his garage. But still, the police were interested in talking to George again. George stayed with his story of hearing a faint scream, but he added some new information. He now said that he remembered seeing a tall man with red hair in the front yard of David's house. George's story started to fall apart in other ways as well. For example, he initially said that he had not seen Karen on the day she was murdered, but now he was telling the police that he saw her washing dishes through her kitchen window. The police continued to interview George over the course of the next few months. His story changed a few times. In addition to seeing a tall man in the front yard, George said he talked to the man. The mysterious red-haired man threatened to kill George if he told anybody that he had seen him. Eventually, the police were able to match the partial bloody footprint found in the bathroom to George's foot. They confronted George with this new inculpatory information, but he had an explanation. George said that after hearing the scream, he entered David's house. He found Karen on the floor with her throat cut. He stepped in her blood and went to the bathroom to try to clean up. The police found it curious that George knew how Karen died because they never released her cause of death. Another thing that was interesting about his statement was that it took an autopsy to figure out her cause of death. It was not immediately clear from looking at her. So even if George had wandered in and seen Karen's body, he would not have known that her throat was cut. This really made it look like George was the killer. In March 1986, George Lewis was arrested and charged with murder. He would later be convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. George Lewis died in 2015 at the age of 52. Now moving to my analysis. The case against George Lewis seemed pretty straightforward, but there were several Brady violations in this case which raised some doubt about his conviction, so the prosecution did not release some exculpatory evidence to the defense. There are many elements of this case that don't sit quite right with people, including the fact that the detective who arrested George was a good friend of his. The detective even officiated George's wedding. This brings me to the question, was George Lewis actually guilty? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he is guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. George lived close to David's house, which is where Karen was. George had a history involving several elements connected to sex. He was sexually aggressive, he was highly interested in images featuring sex, and he was in a swingers club. After seeing Karen in a bikini, George told a friend of his that he wanted to have sex with her in a group format. George's first wife implied that he was violent and a pathological liar. Their marriage didn't even last a year. George allegedly was a prowler. He would look through his neighbors' windows. He said that he was doing this as part of his neighborhood watch responsibilities. I guess like Neighborhood Watch Stalker Edition. It appears as though George really didn't understand the concept behind Neighborhood Watch. It doesn't mean watching the inside of neighbors' houses. George's girlfriend, Glenda, who would later become his wife, said that when she heard the scream, she thought that George was in his garage. When she looked at the garage, it was dark. Glenda said that George entered the house 20 minutes after she heard the scream, saying that he heard it too. This is when he told her that he investigated but didn't find anything. Karen's boyfriend, David, told the police that he thought only one item was missing from his house. It was a white teddy, like the lingerie. A woman with whom George was having an affair went to the police and said that George had given her a white teddy. It matched the description of the one missing from David's house. George changed his story several times throughout the course of the investigation. He eventually admitted to being in David's house. George knew that Karen's throat had been cut, and there was really no way he could have known that unless he was the killer. George's footprint was found in the bathroom of David's house. George said he saw a tall, red-haired man wearing sandals in the front yard of David's house, and that man threatened him. This story is just about impossible to believe. Moving to the exculpatory factors, there were no witnesses to the crime, no video, no evidence other than the footprint tied George to the crime scene. Perhaps he was telling the truth about entering the residence after Karen was murdered. George had a lot of friends on the police force. Maybe they supplied him the information about Karen's throat being cut. George did not have any injuries on him consistent with a struggle. If he was the killer, his clothing would have been covered in blood, yet the clothing was never found. When considering all the evidence, do I think that George was guilty? Yes, I think he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The evidence in this case is actually nothing short of overwhelming. From what I understand, much of the support behind George came from his fellow firefighters. I think the support for George was really more about a disagreement between firefighters and the police than it was about any specific evidence in the case. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. I think that George was probably psychopathic, narcissistic, and sadistic. He had very poor impulse control and was extremely excitement-seeking. After watching Karen for a short time, he developed a strong desire to have sex with her. George was in his garage working on his vehicle when he saw Karen come home from visiting with her friend. He decided to make his move. George somehow convinced Karen to let him in the house. He made an advance. She rejected him, and he murdered her. During the murder, Karen screamed loudly. George knew that the neighbors heard the scream. He exited out of the bedroom window without cleaning the bloody footprint from the bathroom. Somehow, he made it back to his house undetected. His psychopathy allowed him to stay calm and go to bed with his girlfriend as if he had not just committed a murder. George disposed of his bloody clothing and hoped he could escape justice. George probably believed that he left a lot of physical evidence behind. When the police mentioned the relatively insignificant discrepancy about the volume of the scream, like George said it was faint, but someone else heard it 3 or 4 blocks away, George immediately started lying out of desperation. The police really didn't have a lot against him at that moment, but George thought that the police had more evidence than they really did. Moving to the last question, why didn't the neighbors call the police when they heard the scream? As I mentioned, over a dozen neighbors heard the scream. When the police asked them why they didn't report it, they came up with a variety of excuses. They didn't want to get involved. They convinced themselves that nothing was wrong. They thought it was cats or other animals. One neighbor said that they believed it was a woman crying out from a nightmare. Another neighbor said that they were waiting for a second scream. I guess they thought that a real murder victim always screams twice. One thing is for sure about the neighborhood where Karen was murdered. They had the worst neighborhood watch program in history. The unofficial leader watched through the windows of his neighbors and eventually murdered a neighbor. In addition, the neighbors literally interpreted the title Neighborhood Watch as the extent of their obligation. I could picture the neighbors saying something like, well, we have a neighborhood watch, and we were watching. What else were we supposed to do? It's not a neighborhood watch and call the police program. Those are my thoughts in the case of Karen Gregory and George Lewis. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.